Last Sunday, if you missed out, we just want you to know we had a great time going to the Travelers game as a church family. Now, there was an incident at this game where I still haven't figured out who was responsible, but somehow or another I got roped in to playing some game on the field between innings. And it involved me having to get on a little toy car and push that car around the outfield. Exactly. But I will say this. Out of all the people that were in the race, I came in second. Out of three. But it was because I had to be barefoot. Had I had my tennis shoes on, it would have been a different story. Look, that's my story. But I will find out who set all this up. Just know. I'm going to find out.
Sarah has a story. She said she only lost, was it third place, so she didn't make you and Chris look bad.
And we appreciate it. We are very grateful for that too. But see, you may not realize this. I used to be fast. Contrary to what you may have seen on Saturday or Sunday, or what some of you have seen on Facebook, because there's this video going around of this said event. But let me just tell you, back when I'll tell you about my first junior high football experience. See, I used to be fast, and I used to be in shape. Two things that have long since gone away. But I'll never will forget. It was our first game of the season. I was in 7th grade playing junior high football. And let me just kind of set the stage. I was the secret weapon. That's what my coach told me. That I was the secret weapon. And we had some plays that we were going to run specifically for me, that he was going to give me the signal, and I was supposed to run in, do that play, and that was going to be what was going to change the game. So I was ready. I was ready to be the secret weapon. So the game started. And of course, at one point, I'm right by waiting for him to give me the signal. At one point, he had to say, "Go away," because I was kind of underfoot. So I got to a place where I could see him. And finally, the moment came. I got the signal. He said, "The next play, go in and run the play." So I was ready. I knew that I was about to become a legend. And I was right. Because, see, I was so excited. I was so pumped. I was so ready to go in. I neglected to kind of pay attention to what was going on around me. And when he said, "Go," I took off. What I failed to notice was the officials who, at the same time I was charging onto the field, they were moving the first down chain. Yeah, you see where this is going. And so, in my excitement, I just took off, and they happened to take off and start pulling the chain, and we met, and we tangled, and I took one of them down with me. And it took 2 or 3 minutes to untangle, get everybody up, and I became a legend in that moment. And that is a true story. One that did not turn out quite like I had in my own mind. I was not quite the secret weapon that I was envisioning. But see, sometimes things don't turn out like we expect. Sometimes the way we envision something and the way that it actually goes down are very different scenarios. So the question is, what happens when life doesn't meet your expectations? What happens in those moments where you have disappointments, extreme letdowns, moments where you just say, I don't understand. This shouldn't be happening. It wasn't supposed to be like this. See, we're going to look at some young men today, some teenage guys who have a story like that. That they were living their lives, they were doing everything right, and then they encountered something that they had no control over. Everything was happening to them, and all they could do was put their faith and trust in God. That was the only option. And it's an incredible lesson for us. Because here's one thing I know. Life's going to throw you curveballs. The unexpected is going to happen. And the question for every one of us is, can your faith handle that? Can your faith handle those moments when you feel like, God, you let me down? This shouldn't be happening. Let's meet these three guys. Let me just give you a little background as we begin the story. We're going to be in the book of Daniel this morning. And we're going to meet a king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. So one of the things Nebuchadnezzar did is he conquered the nation of Judah. And when he did that, when he conquered that nation, he sent in his people and he said, I want you to go and I want you to find the best of the best. Go find the best young men, the best boys, the ones who look the most healthy or the most intelligent, just the best of the best, and I want you to bring them back here because we're going to train them to work for us. And so here's what they did. They took all those young men, and we know them as Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And today we're going to talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But here's the first thing they did to them. You know that those were not their given names? See, they were originally named names that represented Israel's God, Yahweh. And so one of the first things they did when they brought them out of there into Babylon, they said, we're no longer going to let you be called names that represent your God. We're going to change your name to represent our gods. So they changed their names to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego so that from that moment on, every time they heard their name, they would be reminded that they're now in a foreign country, that they no longer live under the authority of the God of their ancestors, but they serve a new God. That was what they wanted them to think. Because we know that there's power in a name. How many of you have grown up in a situation where you spent your entire life being told that you don't measure up? That you're not good enough? That you'll never accomplish your dreams? Because here's the truth. If you get told something enough, you probably will start to believe it. And that was the goal of Babylon. They wanted them to start to consider themselves no longer Jews, but part of this nation. So they said, we're going to give you a new name so that you can kind of come to terms with this new identity, this new life of yours. But guess what? That's not the end of their story. Look at Daniel chapter 3, starting in verse 1. Look at what it says. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And he then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. So the king had set up this image. It was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. That was the size of this statue. entirely made of gold. And his expectations were, at the signal, everyone is going to bow down to this statue. And everyone means everyone. So look what it says in verse 4. It says, "The herald loudly proclaimed, 'Nations and people of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace.'" So he said, as soon as you get the signal, as soon as the music starts, everybody bow. And everybody did, except for 3 guys. Our friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Let's keep reading. Go to verse 12. Look what it says. It says, "There are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve you, your gods, nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" So they're in a pretty difficult situation. And so here's the deal. Here's the question for today. Can your faith handle the fire? Because that's what these guys were up against. They were told, you have 2 options. You can bow down before the statue or get burned to death. That was the choice. So here's what I want you to think about. A faith that is tested by fire is a faith that can be trusted. See, a faith that endures the fiery trials of life is a faith that can be trusted. Ask yourself this. Can my faith handle the trial of unanswered prayer? I mean, say you pray and you pray and you pray and you have this expectation and it doesn't turn out that way. Can your faith handle personal loss? Loss of health, loss of someone that you love. What happens if you're like a whole lot of families and the desperate cry of your heart as a married couple is to say, we've been trying for years to conceive a child, and it's just not happening? Or worse, what if you finally get to that place and you get the joy of finally saying, hey, getting to share, we're pregnant. And then a month later you find out we lost it. See, a lot of people, their faith, they get to those hard moments. And when those times of testing, those moments where you have to say, I don't understand, but I trust you, God. A lot of people, they turn and walk away and say, God, you let me down. I gave you a chance, God, and you didn't come through. And see, that's why this is one of my favorite stories in Scripture, because what we see here is these 3 young men who are only teenagers. They're faced with an impossible situation. But what we can learn from here is that if we let God be God, and we understand that sometimes God's going to do things that are different from the way we would have done them. But if we learn to let that be okay, we can experience the kind of life, what Jesus called abundant life, fulfilling life. But so often we let our own expectations get in the way and say, God, I want you to make this happen for me because this is what I want, when that's not what God wants. And then there's friction. But I love what happens in the life of these three young men. I mean, think about it. Think about the situation they were in. How easy would it have been for them to come to a place where they said, look, we've got hopes and dreams for our lives. We've got the majority of our life still ahead of us, and we've got a choice. We can either bow down to this statue, or we can die. That would pretty much end our hopes and dreams. You know, last time I checked, that's hard to overcome, that whole death thing. And so, think about the situation these guys were in. Think about how tempting it would have been to say, look, God knows. God knows what we're really doing. What if we, when that music plays, what if we just kind of stumble? Maybe we don't actually bow down, but what if you just lean over a little bit? Maybe when the music plays, you drop something, I'll reach down and pick it up for you. How easy would it have been to start going through all the reasons why, look, if we don't do this, we die. And then we can't do anything else. And that was the choice. It was pretty much an impossible choice. Because we all get in those places where we begin to rationalize. God, look, God will understand that if the alternative is death, I can bow down without really bowing down. I won't mean it. I'm just pretending. I'm not really compromising. I'm just giving the appearance of compromise, but I'm still loyal to God. And see, God knows that. So God will forgive me if I compromise just this one time. And we have those kind of conversations with ourselves. What if I can get away with this? And God will understand because He knows that I'm pretty good otherwise. But the only problem with that kind of thinking is that when we begin to rationalize one thing, it always leads to more rationalizing. It always begins to take you down a path. It never stops with just that one. And before you know it, you're living a life of compromise. You're no longer serving God. So what do we do when our faith is tested by fire? Those moments that we're all going to face. And the first thing is this. We obey God's commands instead of man's expectations. We should always obey the commands of God rather than the expectations of people. I love their response. Look at verse 16. Look what it says. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. I mean, think about it. They had made their decision long before they ever got put in this situation where their loyalties lie. They didn't have to have a meeting with one another and say, guys, huddle up. Let's really think this through. Why don't we make out a pros and cons list and say, okay, let's be rational here. We can bow or we can die. What do y'all want to do? They didn't have to ask the king, look, can we just take a little time? Can we just have some time to kind of process this, weigh out what we really want to do? Because we're kind of on the fence a little bit. No. they said, King, we don't have to respond to you here. We don't even need to defend ourselves because we've already made up our mind. We know what we're going to do. See, those of you right now that are in a situation where you're walking through these kind of choices, you're saying, okay, should we compromise? Should I just cheat a little here? Nobody will ever know. And look at the benefits we'll get if we do this. It won't be that big a deal. God will even understand. No. We must always obey God's commands instead of those things that people put in front of us. Now, the second thing we can learn, the second principle that we can take away from this is this. And this is huge. We learn to believe God's truth instead of the facts. Now, some of you are going, wait, truth and isn't that the same thing? No, it's very different. I want you to really see the amazing truth in what these guys said to the king. The king said, bow down and worship. And they said, we're not going to do it. And he said, if you don't, who is going to save you from the fire? They had an answer. They said, the God that we serve is able to save us from the fire. Not the God that we've heard about, not the God that we've talked about in church, not the God that our ancestors worshiped, the God that we know, the God that we serve, the God that we have a relationship with. He is able to save us. That's what he said. Look at verse 17. They said that outright. They said, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God that we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. They're standing before the king, and they're saying, King, look, you do whatever it is you got to do, but we've already made our choice, and it's not you. It's not your statue. We will never bow down. And so, what's the difference between believing God's truth and the facts? Well, what were some of the facts here? The king said, bow down. That's a fact. They didn't do it. That's another fact. The king was angry. Another fact. The king was building a huge bonfire. Fact. That fire was hot. Fact. Everyone thrown into the fire got turned into s'mores. Fact. They were about to get thrown into the fire. Fact. Our God will deliver us. Truth. See, that's the difference. We don't just believe the facts of the current situation. Those are what they are. But God's truth separates everything from those simple facts. And that plays out all throughout Scripture. I mean, think about it. The fact is, it's humanly impossible to walk on water. But the truth is, Jesus did it, and so did Peter through the power of God. The fact is, when you're dead, you're dead. But the truth is, Jesus died, he came back, he raised other people from the dead. The facts may be that you're in financial trouble and you've got more month left than money. The truth is, God's your provider. The facts may be the doctor says there's no hope. But the truth is, Jesus is the great physician. The facts may be that you think your marriage is in big, big trouble. But the truth is, God is a God of restoration. See, the fact of the matter may be that you're in an impossible situation and you don't know what to do. But the truth is, God is God of the impossible. See, we don't just look at the facts, but we look at God's truth. The fact may be you might right now feel very far from God. But the truth is, God is pursuing you right now. He's never running from us. He is always running after us. And that's the truth. See, we have to learn to distinguish between what the facts are and what God's truth is. So we can make a God decision, not just a good decision. That's what we want to do. So what do you do when your faith is tested by fire? We obey God's commands instead of man's expectations. We believe God's truth instead of simply looking at the facts. And the third thing is this. We believe God. We don't just believe in God. We believe God. See, these three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they didn't just believe that there was a God, the God of their ancestors, but they believed Him enough to put it all on the line. They said, we believe that our God is big enough to rescue us. We believe that He is able. But then they didn't stop there. Look what verse 18 says. This is where their faith, they have faith on steroids. We believe God will. We believe God is able. But even if He does not, even if He doesn't do what we think He can do, even if He doesn't do what we think He should do, what we want Him to do, we want you to know, King, that we will never serve your gods. We will never worship the image of gold you have set up. Because we serve the true God. See that? We believe that He will, but even if He doesn't, we're not going to waver. We're not going to lose hope. We're not going to lose faith. It's kind of like we talked about last week. A faith of no matter what, we're sticking with God. That's the deepest form of faith. The kind of faith that says, regardless of the circumstances, God, I trust you. No matter what happens, no matter what we face, no matter what we're walking through, so God, even if things get as bad as they can get, I will not waver. I will not give up on you, God. A faith of no matter what. When we get to that place in life where we can actually say that, where we can actually say, just like these young men, no matter what you do, no matter what you put in front of us, we will never compromise. That's the kind of faith God wants us to have. Now let's see the rest of the story. Look what it says in verse 19. So after they stood tall and said, King, you do whatever it is you got to do, well, that just ticked him off. Because he had already challenged them. He said, who is big enough to take me on? Who is going to save you from me, from my fire? Look what it says. It said, Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in the army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. So the fire was so hot, the flames couldn't be contained by the furnace itself. The very men that were trying to push them in got consumed by the fire. That's pretty hot. But then look what it says in verse 24. It said, King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." And he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Because that's who it was. It was a messenger from God, an angel, an angelic being. You know, you may never really know just how good the presence of God is in your life until you're in the middle of a fire. That's when you experience the fullness of the power of God at work in your life if you give God the opportunity to walk with you through it. These guys, they didn't know what was going to happen. All they knew was they couldn't compromise. And they were willing to lay it all on the line for that faith. But then look what happened. They got thrown into the fire, and God showed up. Well, what an incredible testimony. See, some of you are walking through situations that are so difficult, and God is bringing you through that for the rest of your life, this situation is going to give other people hope. That, hey, look what God did for them. Maybe we'll survive this too. I mean, look what happened as we finish this chapter, as we finish the story. Look at verse 27. He ordered them brought out, and they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, had not done anything, did not even have a smell of smoke on them. And then look what he says. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." What an incredible testimony of God providing, of faith. See, I've known people that have walked through situations where you just look at them and go, how do you even get up in the morning? I couldn't imagine going through something like this, and their only answer is God's enough. I don't know how I do it, but God does it. God gets me through it. See, that's the kind of faith that God desires for us. He wants us to be able to look at every situation and say, I will never bow down. My faith is with God and God alone. And no matter what anybody puts at me, no matter if my boss says, if I don't compromise at work, I'm going to lose my job. I trust God. No matter what, you say, I've spent my life praying for my kids, and they have all gone down bad paths. I'm trusting God. Every situation, no matter what we face, our response is, I'm going to trust God. That's the kind of faith God desires for us. Now, is that going to be incredibly difficult in those moments? Absolutely. The temptation will always be there to compromise, to do what seems easiest in that moment, just to survive. But then, look at what these young men would have missed out on. Not only did they not die from the fire, but the God that they serve, the God that rescued them now, was elevated in the eyes of the king and put in his rightful place. And they became almost untouchable after that. They went from certain death to God raising them up to have more influence than they could ever imagine in His name. And see, that's the difference. They weren't looking for their own glory. They were always thinking about God's glory. And that's what they were never willing to compromise. Who God is. See, I think that's what gets us in a lot of trouble sometimes is we always ask the question, what's in it for me? How will this really impact me? And that drives our ultimate decision making way too much of the time. Instead of saying, what does God really want me to do? What has God already spoken about how I should handle this? And then let God be in charge of what happens after that. Not us trying to be in control all the time and trying to move the pieces around ourselves to get the result that we're looking for. When we can fully give up control and say, God, I trust you no matter what. That's where God wants us to live our lives as followers of Him. There may be some of you in here that the choice that you need to make today is to say, God, I'm ready to trust you with my life. There's never been a time in your life where you said, God, I'm going to put my faith and trust in the fact that you lived a perfect sinless life and you willingly gave up that life and died on a cross to pay a price for my sin that I could never pay for myself.